Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're doing a champion guide on Yone. If you're new around here, I'm a multi-rank 1 challenger mid laner and I played pro play for 4 years from 2017 until 2021. I think Yone overall, really good champion to learn. He's not super hard, so it's like an easy champion for you guys to kind of like put in for your AD champion pools. I think also he has some like really nice transferable skills to like some of the other AD champions that are a bit more difficult. Kind of acts as a gateway to learning those. And also he's just a really strong champion in solo queue. You know, he's got a lot of carry potential. He's really fun to play, obviously, so let's get straight into it. So first off, we're going to talk about Yone's runes. Unfortunately, his runes are actually really easy to understand. So for our keystone at the moment, we're pretty much always going to run Lethal Tempo. In the past, there was a lot of like Fleet Footwork and Conqueror, but now with how strong Lethal Tempo has become, this is kind of what you run just every game. So I'm going to go over that first. I'll quickly, at the end, like talk about these other keystones and when you might use them in the future in case this gets nerfed. But for now, we just take Lethal Tempo literally 100% of the time. But here, the choice really is between Triumph and Overheal. I think Triumph is better overall. Overheal does scale sort of well, but it's like pretty useless for like a good portion of the game. It just doesn't provide that much. But I think Triumph is the best here. Obviously, there's no point taking Presence of Mind. Next is another decision here between Alacrity and Bloodline. I think, in my opinion, Alacrity is the best because you'll normally be building shield bows, so you don't really need extra lifesteal. I have seen some people take this still, but in my opinion, it's overkill. And there's a lot of time you will be overhealing on Yone, so in my opinion, I think Alacrity is the best. You can't really take Tenacity on this champ just because, well, I mean, like, you can take it, but I think just like if you're in a game where you kind of need to take Tenacity or you need to build Merc Treads, you're probably just like in the wrong game for Yone, honestly. I think you really need like the Alacrity to kind of help out your attack speed. Make sure you're hitting like your Q attack speed cap earlier. So yeah, I don't really recommend Tenacity. If you're in that sort of game and there's so much Tenacity, I guess you could take it, but I really think that's just like not the best. Now down here we actually have a few choices. I'd say it's mainly between Cut Down or Coup de Grace. In my opinion, Cut Down is probably the best. I think this helps you deal with tanks and stuff really well, and obviously like just even champs that are like building a bit of HP. To be honest, this it like makes more sense with Yone, but whenever you take it, it just like doesn't really do anything. Like if you look at the damage stats of how much this rune does at the end of the game, it's just like really not that impressive. That being said, if like they're literally all squishy champions, you could probably take it. Lastly, Last Stand is like pretty decent as well. But to be honest, guys, I feel like all three of these runes don't really have a large impact on your gameplay. Like you can min-max this, right? Like for example, you know, if they have more tanks, you could take Cut Down. If they don't, you know, you could take one of these. But I feel like most of these three runes, or just like the three runes in general, don't really impact the game that much. You can kind of just take whatever your personal preference is. So yeah. Now for secondary, we're actually always going to take Resolve secondary on Yone, and it's just like there's a lot of things within this tree you can do. So the first is kind of, this is like the ultra greedy setup. You can take conditioning overgrowth. That's like definitely the best scaling, but it is pretty risky, I think, because like Yone's a champion that sort of is weak in the early game. In my opinion, well, let's just go through it all. So here you can take in the second, there's like nothing worth taking up here for a start. In the second row here, against like champions that are going to poke a lot, so either range auto attackers or like mages and stuff, second wind can be very, very nice. Also, if you're against a champion that has like strong all-ins or something, or ways where they can't easily proc bone plating, basically where bone plating is going to get more use in second wind. So against like assassin champs, other melees, I think bone plating is a lot better. Then on this bottom row here, pretty much all three of these runes are actually pretty decent. I think Overgrowth is probably the best by default. Unflinching is quite good. I think this is like a relatively low investment for Tenacity. So like while here taking Tenacity forces you to give up Alacrity, I think here if you do need Tenacity, Unflinching can be a good way to get it. Also you can take Revitalize. This is it's like better scaling I suppose, but I think like, yeah, honestly, I feel like most of the time Unflinching or Overgrowth is probably better. In my opinion, I think if you can get away with it, you should probably take Conditioning Overgrowth. If not, you could take something like Second Wind Overgrowth, or you could take like Second Wind Revitalize, Bone Plating Revitalize. Basically, you just kind of need to evaluate on the matchup. I think if you're in easy matchups, go with this. Harder matchups, you probably need one of these, and then you can kind of just choose. For your shards, obviously attack speed, AD, and armor and MR, depending on what you want, or depending on what the matchup is. Now, the reason we don't take the other trees is there isn't really anything useful in them anymore. It used to be that we would run Ravenous Hunter, but that's been removed, and also even before that, it was nerfed pretty heavily. So there's nothing else here that's really useful. In sorcery, I guess you could take like Absolute Focus, Gathering Storm, but I think if you want to go like greedy kind of stats, I think the tankier like Conditioning Overgrowth is more valuable overall. And Inspiration doesn't really have anything we want either. Time Warp Tonic isn't really something we can run. Magic Boots kind of just delays your Berserkers. So in essence, like I think Yone's runes are pretty simple. You just run this page most of the time. Now feel free to skip ahead if you want. I'm just going to quickly talk about when these were used in the past. In case Lethal Tempo gets nerfed. So Fleet Footwork used to be used heavily against champions that were very difficult in lane. So you'd see something like Fleet Footwork with Second Wind against champions like Syndra or Ori. And I think these days it's a bit better still to take Lethal Tempo. That allows you to take like better extended trades against them. And I think Fleet in general, it was honestly taken more for the move speed, the dodge abilities, than it was purely for the healing. So yeah, I don't think you really need to take it anymore, but if Lethal Tempo gets significantly nerfed, you could look to take this in hard matchups. Conqueror, again, used to be just the go-to if you were in an easy or even matchup, but now, just like damage-wise, is outdone by Lethal Tempo. I think that is going to be it for Yone's runes. Up next, we have Yone's items. So to start up with the starting items, first off, we have either Doran's Blade or Doran's Shield with a health potion. For me, this mainly depends on the matchup. I think if you're against a ranged champion, you should pretty much always start Doran's Shield unless they're very weak in lane. Basically, Doran's Shield gives you more sustain against like champions that are going to hit you more often. So this is most ranged champions, obviously, because they got poke, they got range autos, but there are some melee champions this could apply to, like maybe a Kali, where they harass you like fairly often. Otherwise, I think if you're in a matchup where you don't get hit as often and you want to like, or rather, I guess you just like aren't going to get punished in lane as much, Doran's Blade would probably be better. If you want a blanket rule, I'd say just like Doran's Shield if you feel like you're going to take damage, / it's like a difficult matchup. Otherwise, just Doran's Blade is fine. If you're not sure though, just take Doran's Shield until you kind of know what you're doing. Now for early buys, this depends again a lot on the matchup, but I think probably the best overall first buy is Berserkers. The reason is it gives you like a ton of attack speed and it gives you a ton of movement speed. And movement speed actually converts into damage a lot of the time for Yone, because when you E after people, you can definitely chase them down and get more auto attacks that you wouldn't be able to get in, both because you have attack speed, but also because you have the movement speed to actually catch up to them. And if you buy boots on your first base and your opponent doesn't, it puts you in such a strong spot. You can like dodge your spells. You kind of get to dictate when trades begin and when trades stop, because you can just like outrun them or you can chase them down. And I think overall, like the tier 2 boots is probably the best first buy, but there are like some other options that you could get. I think, especially once you already have Berserkers, Zeal is insanely good to pick up. Honestly, Zeal in general is just like really, really efficient on Yone. Even though you don't build a Zeal item as your first item, oftentimes people do pick this up if they just base on the perfect gold for it, because you can build a Zeal item second or even third with this, and it just gives you such a huge amount of power in the early game. I think it is a bit of a greedier buy, and also worth noting is it does delay your first item by a bit, so you have to keep that in mind. But Zeal, I think if you base on the right gold for it and you already have boots, it can be worth picking up. And next is Vamp Scepter. I think Vamp Scepter can be quite good to pick up if you're against, there's like two types of champions. So one against champions that want to poke you down continually. So again, using the like Syndra or Orianna options, you can go for the Vamp Scepter. Worth noting is that if you buy the Vamp Scepter before buying boots, sometimes it can actually put you at a disadvantage, because even though you have the sustain, you don't really have the movement speed to dodge your abilities or to like threaten them by running them down. So it should definitely be seen as more of a like neutralizing option rather than as like a winning option. That being said, if you go say like boots into Vamp Scepter, then you become really, really strong. It's just like worth thinking about, right? Like, you know what Vamp Scepter does. It's going to give you a lot of sustain, but it doesn't do that much for your aggression. So it's really if you need it to help survive. Next is Noon Quiver, another like really good item just to pick up if you want raw damage. Yeah, I mean that's like pretty self-explanatory. As just like if you have 1300 gold, you just go ahead and buy it unless you like want to buy components for something else. So yeah, pretty good item. Lastly is a refillable pot. Now this one's actually sort of interesting because on a lot of other champions, I recommend buying refillable pot. On Yone, it's like sort of, you don't always need it. You have a lot of sustain, especially if you're taking Second Wind and Vamp Scepter, so there's a lot of like extra sustain that you'll have from those, in which case buying refillable is pretty useless. On the other hand, if you don't have those things, say like you're just buying boots and you didn't take Second Wind, then you probably will want to pick up refillable because you won't have any other source of sustain other than your Doran's items. So Yeah, you can buy, but also just worth noting that you can skip it as well and save a little bit of extra gold. Root options, you only really have two, either your Berserkers or Merc Treads. I think Berserkers are better in like 99% of games. As I said before, I think if you're in the kind of position where you're forced to buy Merc Treads, not really a good Yone game. You're kind of just like in a real rough situation. I also think that if you do need tenacity, you should try get it from your runes first. Like I would rather probably take like unflinching and maybe even legend tenacity and still build berserkers rather than getting to the point where you're building mercs. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. Hopefully you're just not really in the situation where you have to build this. Another thing that you can kind of think about is that if they do have tons of CC, it might be that you just kind of have to play team fights around that. Like you have to wait for them to use CCs before you go in, or maybe you don't team fight at all. But yeah, overall, I think Berserk is better in 99% of the games. Now, you notice Ninja Tabi is not on here. I think there aren't that many situations where Ninja Tabi make the difference on Yone, because a lot of the time, you're just not getting auto attack. Like even if you're 1v1ing someone, it's like it's normally by the time you have like those sort of items, you have like one item or two items. The fights are either going to be very fast or there's going to be like a lot of CC, right? Like you have your knockup, and then you have your R. So there's like a lot of time where you won't be getting auto attacked, and you can output more. You can create like a bigger health difference by just having more attack speed rather than having armor. So I don't really value Ninja Tabi. Also, another reason, as you'll see later, is there are much better ways to get armor on Yone. If you use standard build, this is actually kind of interesting because I feel like Yone's standard build is actually sort of situational. But I think that these three items, like the Shield Bow, Berserkers, and Infinity Edge, are pretty standard, and I don't think they can really be changed. Now, I think one thing is that if you bought a Zeal, you should probably build it in this order instead. So you could do like Shield Bow, and then your Mortal Reminder, and then your IE in that order. This item is quite cheap, so you can easily get to it. But overall, I think these three items are core, and then after that, honestly, pretty much everything is situational. I guess like Death Dance and Guardian Angel. Well, I don't know. It's hard to say because I think Death Dance and Guardian Angel kind of like fit in every build, but they're situational in that you can build them in different orders. But I think yeah, like you'll probably see these 6 items in most of every build. And just sometimes these last 3 items, it might depend like what you need and which kind of order you build them in. But we'll talk about that more in these the situational items below. But if you just want a standard kind of build guide, I think like these 3 items, and then like honestly, you can build them in this order and it's fine, but there is a little bit of optimization. Now, alternative mythics, I think the only one that's really worth considering is Gale Force. Honestly, I think Shield Bow is better like probably like 100% of the time. I think Gale Force used to be a lot more popular, but it's not as good anymore. Also, I think Shield Bow, it's kind of like makes it a lot easier to play as well. Like you get a lot of extra tanky stats. You get lifesteal as well. So I much prefer it. But people used to do a build with like Gale Force and then BT, so you'd kind of get the lifesteal that way. But it does delay your IE. Yeah, I mean, it could be really good if you're snowballing super hard. I'm not really a fan of it. I prefer Mortal Shield Bow, but just letting you guys know that it exists. The last is the situational items. As you'll see before, there's a lot of those items that we just talked about above as being standard, but they're kind of situational. So after you've built like your core items, you can really kind of like mix and match in whichever order you kind of need things. So starting off with GA can be a really good item to pick up, especially if you have a shutdown. Gives you an extra chance at life, gives you armor, which is very good, obviously, if you're against a heavy AD team. And it's reasonably cheap. Also, another thing worth noting about GA is that it has stopwatch in its build path. So even though this like isn't the best completed item, I guess, compared to some of the others here, has a very nice build path. Stopwatch is pretty much, I would say, almost worth buying, even if you don't intend on building GA. Basically, if you use it well, it gives you one chance to win a fight really hard. So I really like that overall. Next up is Mortal Reminder. So if you're building a Zeal, you're probably going to build this 100% of the time. But if you're not building a Zeal, you would probably only build this if you need the healing reduction. Otherwise, it would probably be better to build some of these other items like Death Dance first. You could still build it later in the game. Like it's a pretty efficient item for how much it costs. But just like basically, if you don't pick up that Zeal, you should probably pick up some other items first unless you need the healing reduction. But you can pick it up just for damage later on in the game. Now next is Death Dance. This I would say is like the most standard situational item. I think this is like really strong. And I think if you don't build the Zeal, you should probably pick this up after your kind of like 3 core here. So I really like this stance, just like super good overall. Gives you the armor and kind of like, you know, this ignore pain thing where damage taken is dealt to you over time. That's really nice because you have a lot of lifesteal, right? So if you don't get bursted, it's a lot easier for you to just like keep sustaining through the fight and keep living. So yeah, I think it's just like fits Yone really well and a really strong item overall. Next is Wit's End. So again, this is another one that you can build basically whenever you need it. So like you could put Wit's End right here. You could build it after these 3 items. You can build it before IE if you wanted, if you really needed the MR. But basically it's just like the best MR item you can get. And like if before you would be building Merc Treads for MR, this is really where you're going to get it on Yone. And yeah, I mean, it gives you like a lot of damage as well. It gives you a ton of attack speed. So I would say it's probably worth picking up if you see like big AP threats on their team, like they're getting fed, or if they have like a mid jungle that's like very heavy on AP or something like that, it'd definitely be worth picking up. Lastly is the QSS. Honestly, don't need to buy this that much. I'd say the only time you really need to buy it is versus Malzahar. There are some other champions like say Mordekaiser. It actually kind of depends like where you're at, because sometimes on Yone, if Mordekaiser ults you, you can just kill him, right? But also if you fall behind and you don't have it, then you just die each time. So really up to you to kind of identify if you really need this or not. I don't think there's that often that you would need it just for CC. Honestly, I think if you, again, like if it's just CC, you're better off getting like some tenacity or even taking cleanse, we'll talk about in the summoners, and kind of avoiding buying items like this, because Yone's like regular damage items like Shiobo and IE are so much better, and you don't really want to be spending money on stuff that doesn't do damage on Yone. But I can kind of conclude this. I feel like the itemization is pretty straightforward. Most of these situational items can be built in kind of whatever order you want. I'd say probably the best build is something like this overall. This is probably the most standard, like if you wanted a cookie cutter build for literally every game. But really the most important thing is that eventually you have these 3 items here. Once Yone hits this 2 item spike of his Mythic and IE, he's probably the strongest champion on the map at that point, and you just like scale even harder beyond that point. So yeah, really OP at that point. Again, if you have any questions about the items, just put them below and I'll get back to you on that. But I think that's it for the item section. So for sums, we do have a few options. Obviously, we're going to be taking Flash pretty much every game. There's a lot you can do with Flash and Yone, as we'll get into a bit later. So I think that's the best overall. Secondary, I think the probably 3 most common are TP, Ignite, and Cleanse. I think Ignite is probably your... I wouldn't say it's the standard. I think if you're in a matchup where you don't think you're gonna get like destroyed in the early game, basically if you think you can survive the first few levels without taking a significant amount of damage, then Ignite's probably the best. It'll help you snowball a lot and secure kills in the mid game. I think Ignite is definitely the greedy option, but it's like really good if you can get away with it. I think the most standard is probably TP, and that's just because Yone is like normally a little weak in those first few levels. But in against like melee matchups where you can't like lose as hard in the early game, or if you're against a weak range champion, I think you can get away with you know, taking the Ignite instead. But if you're against, you know, something that actually bullies you hard, like a Vex or Ori or a Lucian, you know, these sort of champs, you kind of need TP. Otherwise, you're just going to fall a bit too far behind in the 1v1 to ever really like kill them with Ignite anyway. Cleanse can be taken, I think. Yeah, I mean, Cleanse is good, but the problem is this like hurts your early game a lot. So you have to be like, you have to be getting a lot out of this, and it has to be like really unplayable for you without Cleanse to be worth taking. I think otherwise it would just be better to get the tenacity kind of like through your runes. But there are some games where you could take Cleanse, maybe against champs like Vega or something. Cleanse could be quite valuable. But yeah, other than that, I don't really see much kind of point in it. I guess maybe the last thing you could take is Exhaust. There aren't many matchups I would take this in, but maybe against some of the other Burst Assassins. The thing is on Yone, because you will win extended trades against basically everyone, the only thing you need to worry about is getting bursted down. So if you're against like maybe a Zed or a Fizz or something, you could find Exhaust, just like exhausting their combo, and then you just like win the trade from then on out to be valuable. But I think also you could probably Ignite in these matchups as well. So it's up to you. I don't think you need to overthink sums too hard on Yone. Most of the time, just Flash Ignite or Flash DP will do enough for you. Let's get into Yone's abilities. So first off, we have the passive. Basically, the first thing about this, pretty OP, is that every second attack deals 50% magic damage. That's actually really important because it makes Yone super hard to itemize against. Like even champions that build a lot of armor will kind of get destroyed by you. So really OP passive. The second thing is that Yone's crit is increased by 150%. Basically, that just means that you can cap crit way earlier in the game than other champions. And like, for example, you don't need to wait for like 2 crit items to build your IE third. You can just get it second. Also, if you go over the crit chance, you do gain bonus AD, so it's not completely over the crit cap. Sorry, you do gain bonus AD, so it's not completely useless at that point. But it probably is still better to build other items, but there's no harm really in building more crit items either. So first off, the Q, all this is basically just a stab forward line skill shot, and it stacks up a couple times. So for example, after you Q once, and then you get a second stack if you use it within like enough time, and then you get this like tornado here that knocks people up like this. So another kind of key component of this is that its cooldown and cast time are reduced with attack speed. So if you if we go to the shop and we just buy a bunch of attack speed right here, you'll see that the Q cooldown and animation are much quicker, and you can execute your combos way quicker. So that's like really important, and that's why we rush like attack speed so early in the game, is because it makes this like way more fluid and harder to deal with. Next we have the W. This is a cone skill shot. It deals mixed damage, so very annoying to deal with. Also, you get a shield, and the shield amount is bigger if you hit more champions. Worth noting though is you actually still get a shield even if you hit creeps, although it's a very small shield. So that can kind of be useful in laning phase. A lot of the time you can just like CS with this, and it also kind of like negates an auto attack. But obviously if you have more champions, you get a bigger shield, which is going to be really useful in team fighting. You want to kind of hit multiple people with this. Another thing about this is that it's, again, the cooldown and cast time are reduced by attack speed. So just another reason really for us to rush attack speed. Yeah, basically just worth noting for that. Next we have the E. The way this works is like you enter the second form, and then after this bar expires, you go back to it. Also, you can activate it again at any time. So for example, if you just want to go back at any time, you can do this. And the way this works basically is that you gain a little bit of movement speed, and also depending on how many points in it, it kind of like does repeated damage. So for example, you know, if you do 100 damage, right now it repeats 25% of the damage, so it will do 25 of that 100 damage to all those champions during that time. So that's pretty nice. Basically, it just increases your damage a lot, and the more attacks you can get off while you're in this form will increase the amount of damage. When you go to the end, see there's that little like pop at the end. Another thing that's like cool with this is that you can use it to jump walls like this. And yeah, there's like a lot of uses to this. Like for example, you can finish off kills with it. You can also use it in tandem with your ult, as we'll see later. You can use it to get CS that's further up. I guess like maybe the scariest thing about it is that people know where you'll go back to. So oftentimes like people will camp at the other end of it. So you do have to be a little bit careful with that, but it's not too hard to use. And it does give you kind of like a safety net. You can play as aggressive as some of the other champs without having to full commit. You can always go back. I guess another final thing about it is that if you get CC'd, you actually don't go back. Like, for example, even if your thing is about to expire, if you get CC'd here, you will actually stay for like a second longer or until the CC ends before you snap back. So just worth noting that you don't want to just like get yourself in a CC chain and then not be able to go back until the CC ends. Finally, we have the ult, another ability that does mixed damage, kind of ridiculous at this point. It's kind of a teleports behind you, nothing personnel kid. And it knocks up anyone and like brings them towards Yone. So for example, if there are a bunch of people here, you can cast it with them and it'll bring them all together, which makes them very easy to AoE. It can be used to jump walls and everything like that. So there's a lot of utility in it. Worth noting though, as it can be sort of hard to escape with. For example, if you want to ult over this wall, but there are people blocking, it'll just put you on the other side of it. So that's worth noting because sometimes, you know, people will go in front of it or it can be difficult to get out. You can use this in tandem with other abilities. For example, you can E and then R, and obviously that all works together. Probably we'll go over this a bit more in the next section, but there's a lot of stuff you can do to make hitting your ult a little bit easier. But yeah, the main things for abilities, guys, they're not super hard to use. We max Q first, then E, W last, and putting a point in R whenever we can. So it's super simple. Let's move on to the next section. All right, now let's go over some of Yone's combos as well as tips and tricks. Probably the first thing that I think is really important for you guys is you really need to be weaving auto attacks between every skill. Obviously it's a lot easier with more attack speed, but lethal tempo makes this easier as well. But you really don't just want to be like QWing and stuff like this. you really, if you can, you want to be like weaving auto attacks between everything. This will increase your damage by like a huge amount, like a large amount of Yone's damage comes from auto attacks, and especially if you're using your E, this will add up to a lot more damage. Another trick that I think is quite important is that hitting your ult is a lot easier if you knock people up with your Q3 first. So for example, you can always chain it like this, and we can use this with our E as well. So probably the most common like all in will look something like this, and that makes it really hard to dodge. The R in general is like, the hitbox is pretty generous, but to be honest, it's quite slow. Like I think you know, even if they're at the edge of it, it'll definitely grab them. But it's very slow. Like people can flash it, people can dash it, which is why hitting the Q3 first is generally preferable. So there are some flash combos on Yone. I think most of them are pretty useful, but there are some advanced ones I would say are pretty pointless. But let's go over the basic ones. So the first thing is that you can Q flash, W flash, and Q2 flash, and all those are really useful. So just like Q flash, all you need to do is, you know, you Q before flashing, really not much to it. Same with W. So these both can be very useful for helping like snipe kills that are, you know, they're very low or you're expecting them to flash or something like that. You can also do this with a Q2 flash to kind of like create a large amount of distance all of a sudden, so that can be quite useful as well. Another one you can do is you can actually do a Q redirect like this. All you really need to do is like Q towards the target and then flash on the target where you want it to go. That being said, it is a little bit harder than some of the other redirects, like not on Yone, but on other champions. So it's worth practicing. There is like kind of a timing window. You don't just press it straight away. There is actually like sort of a timing window you need to get. Honestly, I don't think that's super practical in game. I guess like there are times where you could use it. But honestly, I feel like there are definitely things that are worth like spending your time on more. But it's certainly worth learning because it will be useful sometime and also looks really cool. For some kind of basic trading combos and how that's going to go, generally you're going to want to stack up like get your Q3 and then like EQ into them. Obviously like weave in as many auto attacks as you can, and when they look to trade back on you, you can just E back. That's basically how trading is going to go in lane. In your early levels, like your level 1 and level 2, you're probably going to just be looking to farm with your W and with your Q without taking too much damage. But it's once you hit level 3 that you can start playing really aggressive. I guess another tip that I would also give is that when you use your R, if you can, try use your E first. Like obviously not all the time, right? Like there will be times where you use your R without your E, but not only does it increase your E damage a lot, but it also makes you, it's like a lot more forgiving, right? Like especially when you're learning, if you mess up your ult, you miss your ult too far in, you can always just go back to your E. But if you ult in, especially if you don't have like your Q3 out, it can be very difficult for you to get out. And yeah, that can be pretty problematic. You don't really have the mobility to get out. It can definitely result in a lot of deaths that you wouldn't normally have. Another thing that I'll kind of give you guys is a tip for team fighting. So it kind of depends on the situation. You can, as I said before, like if you can, you want to try and knock people up with your Q2 before you ult them because it guarantees the CC. But one thing you can do is if the enemy are already CC or if they're all gonna like get ulted anyway, one thing you can do is you can like you can line them up, ult them, and then you can look to Q back through them. So that like gives them a ton of damage and also like continues to CC them for a while. So like for example, if your team has already CC'd them, or if they're like all in a line and they can't really dodge it, or if you're coming from Fog of War as well, that can be really nice. We'll go over that a bit more in the team fighting section, but using Fog of War will help you quite a lot on Yone as well. I think that's pretty much it for his mechanics and tips and tricks. Honestly, I don't think he's the most difficult mechanical champion. He's definitely a lot easier than like Yasuo or something, and that makes him quite like good to pick up. I think there's not like a ton of investment that you have to put in to get good at the champ. That being said, if there's like one thing you take away from this section, I really think kind of like the fluidity and the speed in which you do your combos is really important. So that's definitely worth practicing. Also making sure you're like weaving in as many auto attacks as possible will make a big difference to how much damage output you kind of do. I've seen a lot of like low elo players, you know, they do too much like walking and stuff, like and not enough auto attacking. So that's really important that you get down as well. So now for the laning section, we're going to go over some range matchups and some melee matchups. I'm starting out here with a Yone versus Syndra matchup. Now I've actually already covered this in my laning guide like overall, and I'd actually really recommend watching that video, specifically the melee versus range section, because I think Yone, in terms of his melee versus range laning, does fit like very much the fundamentals for that. Doesn't have like any sort of gimmick really, but either way, we're going to go over this, but I think you might find that video helpful as well. So as Yone versus Syndra, I think. Oh, hold on, we got a little bit of artifacting here. Okay, so as Yone versus Syndra, I think like whereas Yone versus like most melee range champions early, you're kind of on the back foot. You mainly just like want to sustain. This was actually from last year, so this is when Fleet was still common. So now we don't use this anymore. We just use the Second Wind and Doran Shield. But generally, you kind of outpace range champions in terms of like HP to mana. So like oftentimes they will run out of mana before you run out of HP, as long as you don't like eat literally every skill shot. Also, there's a couple other things you have going for you. You normally win extended trades, so like they will win burst trades, but if they ever waste cooldowns, very easy for you to run them down. And another thing is you have like reasonably good gank setup, so pre-6, obviously you have your Q2, which you can use with your E, and post-6 you have your ult as well, so these like immobile champions find it very hard to deal with you. So generally, as your first couple levels, you're just wanting to avoid as much kind of like damage as possible. Look to grab what CS you can and dodge what skill shots you can. Really, you can't pressure that much until you hit level 3. That's just kind of like the way it goes versus ranged champions. You can take E level 2 sometimes in pressure, but there's not that many champions that you could pressure at level 2 anyway. But once you do get that point in E, you'll see when you get your Q2, you can look to be aggressive, even if you miss it like this here. Obviously, it's like better if you hit it right, but because you win extended trades, you can look to chase them down, and normally that'll go quite well for you. And another thing that's like nice is that you'll see, especially in a matchup like this, where the champion has mana problems, is you can afford to trade even an HP because you'll like sustain it back up, and they won't have the mana to keep kind of like keeping you down. Another thing that's really important in these sort of matchups is keeping the wave somewhat close to your tower. It obviously makes them more gankable, and it makes it safer for you to farm. So if you can keep the wave kind of on your side like this, or at least like not under their tower, like in the middle or on your side, it's good. And that can make it a lot scarier for them to play. So this sort of situation is really good here because you see Syndra doesn't really have the mana anymore to like get through all my HP. So she knows now that she doesn't really have kill threat on me anymore, which means I can actually play quite aggressively on the creeps. You can see I'm 27 CS to 18, and I'm like zoning her off the creeps and stuff like that. So this is really like the god situation for you to be in, where you know your opponent now doesn't have any real threat on you, and you can either just like look to take trades, look to deny CS, or even look to set up ganks on her, like you'll see here. So I get my Q2, we chase Syndra. And we do get her flash here, which is pretty nice. And that's another situation where, like, later on, you're going to be able to bully that really hard because, like, Syndra having no flash against, like, a ganking champion is going to be really difficult for her to play out. So those are kind of, like, the main things. I guess the TLDR of all that is, like, your wave is pretty important. You need it to be on your side so that you can, like, run people down. Typically, you win extended trades. You have a lot of sustain. So generally, you can, like, attack ranged champions' mana pools. And in level 1 and 2, you need to be pretty safe. But after that, you can look to be quite aggressive with your trades. So yeah, you can see like pretty much here, this is a super good spot to be in. Syndra has like no mana. Like she's at the point where I can just like spam shove waves under her tower, and she eventually is just gonna have to choose to lose a wave. Like she can stay under tower and keep CSing with just auto attacks, but she has no pressure on the map. Obviously, which is very important, and obviously she has no pressure on me. You can see the Nocturne. This is one thing you will need to be care about, is that a lot of these range champions do have quite good gank setup, and Yone naturally is quite gankable, being a melee champion. So you do need to kind of keep an eye on where the enemy jungler is. But if you play out the early game well, I think going even is at least is probably like. Well, generally, if you can go even, you're actually kind of ahead as Yone. But Yone's like sort of unique in that he also has the tools to like really hard snowball matchups as well. Like, despite being a champion that's weaker early, if you get through the early game without really taking too much damage, once you're kind of like off your first back, you become really, really strong, and then you can start looking to really snowball over your lane. Just want to show you guys a couple other examples of kind of like how it'll go after level 6. So generally after level 6, you're going to be looking for extended trades, kind of just like pre-6 actually. The only real difference is you have your ult, and that just means like if you hit a Q2, you can probably follow up with your ult. Honestly, Yone pre-6 doesn't play very different to pre-6. Pretty much it's just like there's Yone at level 1 and level 2, and then there's just like Yone at the rest of it. That being said, one advantage you do have at level 6 is that you get Oh, let me fix that. One advantage you do get at level 6 is you get really insane gank setup. So if anyone ever does burn their flash, it becomes very, very difficult for them to play against you. And that's something you really want to look for. And that's like why you want the wave like in a gankable spot if you can. Another thing kind of worth noting is that it's not super easy to roam on Yone. Like, it depends what champs you verse. But a lot of the time you will just be looking to bully your own lane. Although you can use your mid prior to like farm camps and stuff because you do farm very quick. And yeah, depending on like what the like bot lane champions, for example, are, sometimes they'll be quite gankable for you, sometimes they won't be. Kind of just depends if you have a way to reach them with your Q2 or with your ult. So you kind of just like got to evaluate that in the moment. I think that's it for range matchups. Kind of the TLDRs, your wave management is really important. How you play the first couple levels is also really important. Not taking too much damage. You know, make sure you're taking extended trade, punishing cooldowns, everything like that. To be honest, I don't feel like Yone's lane phase is very different from any other melee champion. It's really just about those laning fundamentals. Again, self-plug, but if you haven't watched my laning guide, I would recommend watching the melee versus range section. I think it basically covers everything here that's important. So yeah, let's move on to some melee matchups. Now for melee versus melee, there's actually a couple examples I want to show you. First, I want to show you the kind of matchup where it's like extended trades versus short trades. So an example like this, where you're playing like Yone versus Akali, or another example could be like Yone versus Zed. Basically, any champion that has like burst trades compared to your extended trades is going to be like more of a skill matchup. Like definitely something where both sides can win. But the main thing to keep in mind is that you will win extended trades. So the longer a trade can go, the better it is for you. And the shorter a trade is, generally the better it will be for your opponent. So in these sort of matchups, the advantage Yone has is generally the extended trading champion does win a level 1, so you can get like that prior. You can use that to kind of like build up your level advantage. Also, another thing is that a lot of these other melee champions have very poor wave clear in the early game, and Yone actually pushes quite fast, so you have a lot of ways that you can actually control the early game against these other melee champions. You'll see in the second example that I'll show after, which will be against like other extended trade early game champions, which are a lot more difficult for you to deal with. But you can see mainly against Akali here. So like essentially Akali's weaknesses in the early game, poor extended trades, but does have good burst trades. Also, she kind of like suffers from wave clear. So you can look to spam push her in, although the only thing you need to be careful about is getting ganked, and you can see that's why Chovy went and put the ward on the Raptor camp here, because that's like going to make sure that he can't get ganked, knowing that Lee is like that area. Another thing that's like sort of important is that you actually don't waste like important cooldowns, because like your opponents, or like in these sort of matchups where they're like burst champions, they would generally look to punish a cooldown. So if you just waste a cooldown, generally you'll get quite hard punished for it. And as we said in the sum section before, if you take exhaust, that can make these matchups quite a bit easier, because it's like another thing they have to kind of burn through. And it also means that if they do try and all in you, if they run out of damage, which is a lot easier to kind of like make them run out of damage when you have exhaust, then often you can clean them up kind of off the back end, just with your extended trades. This is a little bit of an annoying spot where the wave is like this, because it's like quite hard for you to really pressure your opponent, although he did do quite well with his E there, just to keep poking. You actually see like it's really nice here that he's managed to keep pushing. This is like the ideal if you can do it against other melee champions, because that'll allow you to leverage like your minion advantage, and it'll allow you to take a lot of trades on them, kind of like when they're in this situation where they're forced to CS. And it's not like range champions, for example, where they could CS safely under tower. The melee champions kind of have to walk up. But the really scary thing about this is that you're really gankable. So if you want to do this, you do need to be really, really careful. But the lane's going pretty well at the moment, and I'd say we'll watch it a bit more, but I think that those are the main things you kind of really need to know, I guess. Like in summary, like against the burstier like assassins and stuff, pushing will be very important. Also making sure you look for extended trades and be very careful how you use your cooldowns are probably the most important things. And yeah, it's not really laning specific, but also your warding really has to be on point when you're playing a champion like this. And you can actually see here, even though the Akali actually TP'd back, Yone's actually still up in HP, which is pretty impressive. So gonna go for a base here, and this would probably be like very obvious now that you have the tier 2 boots, how the extended trade should go in your favor. We'll see. Yeah, so Akali comes back to lane. I think you'll see now that when Yone looks to trade an Akali, that the trades will go quite well. The only thing you need to be careful of is getting all in. And actually, Vamp Scepter can sort of help with that. Like, one thing that I think is sort of underrated is that like a lot of these like burst champions, they need to get you to a certain point where they can kill you, right? Like they might need to get you to say 70 HP, 70% HP or something. But if later on you build like a Vamp Scepter second, it can help deal with that really, really well because you'll be at 100% HP basically all the time. So essentially, lifesteal is not only useful versus like poke champions, but it can also be quite useful against all-in champions. But again, worth noting is that it does kind of limit or like reduce, I guess, some of your aggressive options. So not something you should go for all the time. So yeah, I think that's basically it for like these kind of like melee versus burst champions. I'm going to show you one more example where you're against an extended trade champion like yourself, but one that just does better than you and kind of like how you're meant to deal with that. So this is an example of Chovy's Yone versus Tryndamere top, and this is actually like a worst case scenario. The reason is, first off, it's a long lane, so the Tryndamere can chase you all the way down. Also, Tryndamere is very similar to you, and then he has like strong extended trades, but he just is kind of stronger than you. So I'd say these sort of matchups, like your Tryndameres, Tryndameres, Fioras, Jaxes, these are like your really hardest matchups, but you're not going to face them very often if you're playing mid Yone, which is what this guide is, primarily created for. I think most of your mid matchups are pretty decent, but if you do come up against a matchup like this, you have to be very, very careful because it's likely that the only way you can win trades is with short burst trades, like where you can knock someone up with like a Q2. As you can see here, the trade does not look too good. But yeah, you can sometimes go for these like short trades if you like knock someone up and then get a couple orders of them and then like go back with your E. But you really, really want to avoid like the extended trades against champions like this. One thing though is like, even though the early game against these champions is quite hard, often later on you can actually deal with them pretty well. Like once you have your 2 items or your 1 item, some of the time you can actually like kill them like in your CC. Like Yone does a ridiculous amount of damage, scales really well. So when you're against like a champion like this, like yeah, just like one of these really strong extended trade champions, you be very, very careful and just like try and look to farm probably like into like at least an item. Or you can sometimes punish them, right, if they do make a mistake, but you've got to be very, very careful in the early game. There are some extended trade champions. Oops, he just died. There are some extended trade champions where you can kind of outplay them. Like a champion like Aurelia, for example, you do have the tools necessary to like dodge her stun and stuff like that. But the reason I'm using Tryndamere as an example is because it's like kind of the worst case scenario. So yeah, some champions like Aurelia I think are difficult, but they're a bit more manageable than something that literally just like runs you down like this. Also, another thing is like obviously if you play this in top lane, it's much worse than in mid lane. Like in mid lane, there is not as much room to run people down. So if you keep the wave on your side of the lane, it's not as difficult. As if you're in top lane, you can kind of get like run down from any point in the lane. So I just wanted to show this to you guys because these are, in my opinion, the matchups like you really want to avoid, where you have a champion that matches you in terms of extended trades. And also, it's not limited to just melee champions. Like I think Cassiopeia is quite a good matchup into Yone. I like playing that quite a lot, and that's also because she has very strong extended trades and kind of beats Yone in his own game. So there aren't that many champions mid lane where you really need to worry about that, but there are some. And yeah, I guess like one final advantage you have going for you is you do have some gank setup. So against a champion like Cassiopeia, for example, you can look for ganks on them like that. There's like a fair amount of punishment there for like the immobile champions. But yeah, so I think that's it mainly for the laning section to kind of TLDR this for you. I think Yone is a very fundamental champion when it comes to laning. Melee versus melee is a lot about like who wins extended trades, stuff like that. Melee versus ranged, a lot about like wave manipulation and punishing cooldowns. Again, if you want more stuff on this, I really recommend checking out my laning guide. I like the melee versus range and melee versus melee sections I went into quite in depth, so I think that'll be probably more helpful than just watching a Yone specific guide, because I think, like, just to reiterate, I think he's a very fundamental champ when it comes to laning. Doesn't have like some weird gimmick in lane like a lot of other champions might have, particularly laning champions, melee champions might have. Yeah, I think that's it for laning. So for your own team fighting, you kind of have 2 main goals and things you should look for. So either you can look to kind of like snipe a key member of their team. So like with Yone's E and R, you can create a large amount of distance. You can easily kill carries like mid laners and ADs pretty easily. And the other thing that you could look for is you can just look to get a big ult. If you notice like a large member or a large like group of their team all together. You could look to get like a big ult on them and kind of set them up for the rest of your team. But that's not as common. I think by far the most common is to kind of like play around walls and play around Fog of War and look for opportunities to kill like the most valuable members of their team. Almost always going to be the mid and AD carry, although it won't always be. So in this example here, the member I really want to kill is Kai'Sa, and you can see like from my kind of area here, I actually have a really good spot here because first off, if I miss my R, I can always go back to my E, but also it allows me to like pretty much just like win this fight from the start by killing their AD carry. And then I can get back in and do a lot of damage here. I managed to knock up the Syndra. So this is kind of like your ideal situation where you're playing from over a wall, like with Fog of War, and you're able to snipe out the kind of like key members of the team fight before the fight even starts. And like one nice thing though, I guess about Yone in general is that like you do still deal a lot of damage, like even to people that aren't super squishy, like you saw the Urgot and the Nautilus there, you still deal with them quite well. So it's not the end of the world if you can't snipe a key carry, you still put out a lot of damage, but like you have the tools to do so. So I think it's like definitely worth looking for. As I kind of mentioned before, it can also be really good to just layer your ult with other people's CC. So while sometimes it can be hard to hit your R on like squishy targets and stuff like that, a lot of the time you can just wait for CC to hit. So you see here, it's pretty easy. This Ahri just gets stunned and she's really easy for me to snipe. So there's a lot of situations like that where sometimes you might want to wait for someone on your team to use CC, or you even might want to wait for them to kind of like use an ability. Like you might want to wait, in this example, you might want to wait for Ahri's ult or for someone to waste flash before you punish them. So I actually think a lot of Yone's team fighting, there's like a lot of thought going into it. You know, there's like cooldowns that have to be baited out. There's like angles you need to create. Honestly, while like Yone, I don't know, like his team fighting, it's not as fundamental as other champs. I feel like Yone is very unique in team fighting and the way his E and R work, where he can cover this huge amount of distance, but also be in like a relative point of safety. He can always come back to that. But I think, yeah, playing from walls and playing from Fog of War is like probably the most common thing that will happen in your team fights, regardless of if you're going for like a, you know, like an ult knockup on like 4 or 5 people, or if you're looking to snipe a key carry. All of that is going to be a lot easier if you're playing kind of from a wall, from Fog of War, like somewhere where you kind of use the terrain to your advantage. Now, one last thing I actually want to cover with the team fighting, again, something that's like more unique to Yone. I guess it's not like, he's not the only champ that can do it, but there are a lot of champions that are very ult reliant. And in this screenshot, for example, Diana is a champion that's very ult reliant. You know, without it, she's not particularly strong. While Yone makes like pretty good use of his ult and his stuff like shield bow, he doesn't actually need them, and he's a much better champion without them than say other champions are without them. So here, we've just had a fight previous to this, and I don't have my ult or my shield bow, but we also know that the enemy team's missing a lot of their cooldowns as well. So in this sort of situation, Yone's actually still very, very strong. Like these other champions, they can't really burst him out, but Yone still has like a huge amount of damage, even without the shield bow and without the even without the shield bow and without the ult, like you still deal just like a ridiculous amount of damage, and you're actually quite strong. So one thing that's like, I guess that's like really important for you guys to know is that even if like if all the cooldowns are burnt, say you're playing a champion like Ori, right? If all the cooldowns get burnt, you might not want to like team fight anymore after that. But if you're playing Yone, you can actually like, after the team fight ends, if there's a re-engage, it's actually like very, very good for you. And I think that is like worth thinking about, because there are a lot of fights that like they're like mostly done, but then like people are low and like thinking about re-engaging. That's actually like the perfect spot for you, because no one really has the ults necessary to actually kill you anymore. Again, you're a champion that needs to be bursted down because you have so much lifesteal and so much sustained damage. So when people are kind of like, when everyone's higher on cooldowns, it's actually more difficult for you than if everyone's lower on cooldowns. So that's another thing that I think is worth considering. Still keep in mind there's kind of team fight fundamentals of like playing over walls, looking to kill like the most important targets on their team, just kind of like all that stuff. But again, like one thing that Yone is very, very good at is that like sustained damage output. So you can afford to stay in the fight a lot longer than other people. So lastly, guys, we have the matchup tiers. In general, kind of as we talked about in the laning phase, the champs that are going to be easiest for you are the ones that are kind of like just like weaker in the early game in general, because Yone is, again, like a very strong scaling champion, but not the best laner. If you can verse something that also doesn't have a strong lane that you can snowball off, that's very, very easy. So you see champs at the bottom that are very, very easy for you to snowball on. Also, I think champions that are very immobile are quite easy for you to deal with, obviously, because you've got a lot of gank set up. and stuff like that. The champs that tend to be more difficult are the ones that either have very good extended trades, so they can match you. So there's a lot of like the top laners on this list, or that aren't on this list rather. Stuff like Fiora Jax could be very difficult. Yeah, Tryndamere as well. Like all those top laners basically are quite annoying. Other champs that can be quite hard for you are ones that are either very immobile, so you don't really have a way to deal with them, or they have like a ton of gank set up as well. Other things that can be annoying are extremely strong burst champions, so stuff like Fizz, or yeah, I guess like Fizz is a really good example of being quite annoying. Although they are winnable matchups, they are quite difficult because they can very easily take a burst trade and get out before you can really extend a trade on them. Personally, I think the most difficult matchups are stuff like Castiel and Anivia, but honestly, these are matchups that are very, very dependent on how good the enemy is of that champion. Although when you verse those two champions in particular, they probably are one tricks. I think they shut down a lot of what Yone wants to do, both in the lane phase and in team fighting. That makes it very, very difficult. I guess, yeah, in general, guys, like this is kind of what I think overall, but I think so much of this, because Yone is like a melee champion, he is like very dependent on like the jungle matchup as well. Like if for example the enemy has like a really strong gank combo, like they have something like what's one that's lower on the list here, like if they have something like say Syndra Lee Sin, even though in the 1v1 Syndra is actually fine, it could be a very, very difficult matchup for you. On the other hand, if you reverse something that was more difficult up here, like say you were versing Cassio, but you had something like Yone Evelyn, it could be very, very difficult for Cassio to play the game. That's kind of the nature of melee champions. They tend to be more reliant on like the jungle matchup than range champions, although it's not true of everyone. I do think it is sometimes the case. Yone in general, if you can get away with the laning phase coming out of the lane even, I think you're probably ahead. You scale really, really well, and once you hit 2 items, you're kind of unstoppable. So these easy champions are more champions that you can like definitely kill in lane and then snowball off and just kind of like be crazily unstoppable. There are a lot of these matchups up here that I think are hard that are actually quite survivable, you know, and some that I'd even say are like close to being winnable or like favored to you. Like I think like Orianna, for example, will bully you quite a lot, but I don't think Ori can ever really kill you. And it's like easy for you to scale, and then you do quite well to her in team fights. There are a couple champions missing off this list, which are I think Vex and Akshan. I think Vex is really, really difficult. Would put her in the hard or perhaps even the very hard tier. Akshan definitely in the hard tier, I think. So those champions can be quite difficult as well. Overall, guys, to kind of conclude the matchup section, I do think Yone is better as a counter pick because he's better against these champs that you can snowball off for free, better against low CC comps. But you can blind pick him if you want. I don't think there are that many champions that just like hard destroy him and make him just like unplayable. Other than if you're playing Yone top lane, I think it's a lot harder. But there are still people like there's the EU Yone one trick that makes that work. So yeah, like I think if you're really good at the champ, obviously you can make it work. That's just my thoughts on it. Hopefully it's helpful for you guys. So that is going to be it for this one, guys. I think to kind of conclude everything, I think Yone is a really good champion to pick up. He's not super hard to play and also has a lot of fundamentals that will translate to other champions. I think he's also good to learn if you want to branch out to melee champions in the future, because I think he's a more forgiving one. They can still like kind of help you learn some of those concepts that'll be useful for playing melee champions later. I also think that in general he is better as a counter pick, but can still be a good blind pick. It's a lot about like how good you are Yone, to be honest. Finally, even though I've said it a couple times, I think I'd really recommend checking out my laning guide, specifically the melee versus range matchup or melee versus melee. I think that'll help you guys a lot with playing Yone. He's a very fundamental champion, at least in the laning phase. So yeah, if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them below. If it helped you guys, go ahead and like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.